We've heard the stories of plagues, illnesses and pandemics through the ages. Stories of the Spanish flu and Black Death conjure up images of the sick and dying.
Ring around the Rosie, a pocket full of posies. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down.
Poor sanitary conditions and unorthodox medical practices of the plague doctors fill the history books. Before 2020, with the advancements in medical practices and technology, the thought of such a pandemic reaching anything close to state, national, or even international lockdown was not on anyone's minds. Groups and social events we all took for granted now seem to be that of the past, as many in the world grapple with the thought of further lockdowns, separated from family and friends. As the current day pandemic continues to rage on, we can't help but look back on the past and see how other horrific and deadly diseases were handled. But what if you were diagnosed with a sickness and not asked to isolate at home, but were removed from society completely and forced to isolate forever? What if this was not ancient history and less than 100 years ago? This is the story of the Island of Death. Leprosy is a dreaded affliction. Tiny bacteria grow and infect the person, which leads to mutilation and causes horrific deformities and disfigurement. The illness begins by presenting on the skin in the form of rashes, lumps, and painful-looking scabs. It can affect the nerves, eyes, and respiratory tract, resulting in images of people that look less human and more like something out of a horror film. It was believed to be highly contagious, although, in a twisted irony, later found it was far less contagious than the common flu. The disease has cursed mankind throughout human history. Evidence shows that it dates back as far as 4,000 years ago, when a skeleton found in India presented with archaeological evidence of leprosy. Yet, studies have shown that the disease may be the oldest human-specific infection, with roots that likely stem back at least 10 million years. As human density increased into villages, then towns and cities, the chances of contracting the disease greatly increased. Throughout history, the illness has been feared and misunderstood, many believing it was a curse from the gods. The name of those afflicted with the disease, lepers, were associated with being unclean, with most people suffering being stigmatized and disowned by relatives, and in many cases, shunned from society altogether. During the Middle Ages in Europe, it was known as the living death, its victims given funeral services to declare them dead to society, and relatives allowed to claim their inheritance and move on with their lives. Leprosy sufferers were required to carry a bell to identify their presence. Often they were forced to wear special clothing and, depending on the wind, were made to walk on a specific side of the street. But in many cases, people infected were often confined against their will in what was known as leper colonies. There have been many leper colonies throughout the ages, some of the most famous being Kalupapa in Hawaii and another found in Carville on the Mississippi River near New Orleans in southern Louisiana. Horrified by the stigma of leprosy, families often just left their infected relatives there and never returned. However, in today's story, we look at Australia's most notorious leper colony on Peel Island, aptly named the Island of Death. Before European settlement, Peel Island was known by the Aboriginal natives as Terek Rura, or the place of many shells. The island was well used by the Aboriginal group of Moreton Bay for its rich land and sea resources. Records indicate Aboriginal groups from surrounding areas used Peel Island as a feasting and ceremonial site. Little did they know that was about to change. Due to its isolation, European settlers in the late 1800s found a much different use for the place of many shells, and began using the island as a quarantine, to detain any ship passengers or crew that may be carrying infectious diseases, to keep those contagious diseases out of the country and stop them from infecting the general population. However, in 1906, the northwest corner of Peel Island was established as a place to send people from across Queensland who had been found to have leprosy, or, in some cases, just vaguely suspect of having leprosy, but more on that later. Usually these people were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to Peel Island. Many mothers, fathers and children never saw their families again. The conditions were less than satisfactory. The Island of Death was prison-like, with dirt floors, huts, patients locked in or chained up, 3 compounds separated patients according to gender and ethnicity. White Europeans were kept apart from those of Aboriginal, Torres Strait Island, or Chinese origin. Escape was almost impossible, with the compound surrounded by a 2.5 metre fence and located 5 kilometres across shark-infested water back to the mainland. It was less a hospital and more of an Alcatraz for the sick. Treatments for the disease on the island were experimental at best, turning these patients into a group of laboratory rats. The different array of ineffective drugs were often painful and in many cases caused more harm than good. Doctors would inject patients with an oil from a nut called the Coolamugara, and although the long-term efficacy of this treatment was weak, it remained the first-line treatment for more than 30 years. It wasn't until almost 1950 that an effective treatment for the condition was found, meaning those sent to the island often remained indefinitely until their inevitable demise. Unfortunately, the stories from this place are not as well known as they should be. Guilt, anxiety, conspiracy and misinformation haunts the history of Peel Island. Family members often suppress this shameful part of their history, yet these stories should be known. Stories of families separated and babies born into horrible conditions. Stories of ships transporting patients in sealed boxes. Stories of cruel living conditions, lack of staff and medical services, and patients dying in pain and misery. There are also stories of people who were thought to have leprosy, but were, in fact, of fine health, forced onto the island to live in isolation. One of these stories was that of Phyllis Ebbage, who was confined and isolated for over 12 years with minimal contact with her family. Thought to have leprosy, she was sent to the island to death, and she retells a chilling story that you can hear in her own words.
You remember approaching the island?
I did.
What could you see when you were approaching the island?
I just looked straight ahead. When the girls were 3 and 2, I wasn't feeling very well. I was very languid and tired and didn't want to do things. That wasn't me. I had some brown marks over me. Your grandfather said, we'll go up to Townsville to see a tropical doctor. When I go to Townsville, gets the test from this tropical doctor, Dr. Bryant, he found it. But I didn't know it. I didn't say goodbye to the girls. I thought I'd be back in a day or 2, and I was going to take them to school. That night, on a Sunday night, dear Grandad Ebbage company, the relations all around the room. The next thing Grandad said, you go. No, I said no. I couldn't say no more. That was the 26th of January 1940. I had to go over on a Tuesday in a boat, 7-mile journey. It was a beautiful place. Why, it was so primitive. Oh, God, there was nothing. Tried a lot of treatments there, nearly killed me. Penicillin, and I had 3 lots of it and they died.
Over all those years, with the testing that they were doing, that you were coming back negative.
Yeah.
Why would they keep you on the island?
I
Over 200 people died on the island while in operation. Due to the breakthrough in the treatment of leprosy in the late 1940s, the need for isolating patients declined, and therefore, so did the purpose of Peel Island. In 1959, the island of death was shut down, with the last remaining patients sent to nearby Brisbane to finish their treatment. Peel Island is now a national park. It remains an archaeological site with some buildings still intact. In an effort to preserve the historic remains, it now sits as a snapshot in time, a more horrible time. So, while you're isolating in your house, watching YouTube or scrolling mindlessly on Instagram and thinking how bad you have it, remember that things could be much worse. You could be chained, isolated and injected with ineffective treatment on the island of death. Until next time, thank you for watching.
Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down.